She bought a tiny house for $5 and everyone laughed at her. But what she found inside completely changed her life. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, watch the next video, and share this video with your friends to show how a small action can change everything. Winter had turned the city into a map of invisible borders. Streets that once felt ordinary now marked the edges of survival, separating the warm interiors from the open cold where those without keys or codes drifted like shadows. The snow had fallen not in the quiet, gentle way people love to photograph, but in relentless sheets that swallowed sidewalks, piled against storefronts, and erased footprints as fast as they were made. The sky stayed low and heavy, a dull slab of gray pressing down on everything beneath it. For most people, it was an inconvenience, a reason to complain while stepping into heated cars or buildings. For her, it was an enemy that never slept. The car had become her shelter weeks ago, though calling it that felt dishonest. It was an aging sedan whose door seals no longer kept the wind out, whose heater sputtered in protest whenever she dared to turn it on for more than a few minutes. Every night, she parked in a different place, memorizing which lots were patrolled and which alley corners were ignored. She learned the rhythms of the city, not from office hours or cafe schedules, but from the quiet patterns of security guards, garbage trucks, and late-night shift workers. There were places where she could disappear for 6 hours before someone knocked on the window, and others where the knock came within minutes. Cold had become a constant presence in her body, not sharp anymore, but deep and dull, like a bruise that refused to fade. Her fingers were always numb, her joints stiff, her lips split open and bled without her noticing until she tasted metal. She slept in layers of clothing that never fully dried, curling into herself on the back seat with a blanket that smelled faintly of damp fabric and old detergent. Each morning she woke before dawn, because the cold would not let her rest any longer. The windows were always crusted with frost on the inside, and she scraped them clear with a credit card she no longer used, breathing clouds into the small dead space of the car. It had not happened all at once. There had been a job once, steady if not glamorous, a place she went 5 days a week where people knew her name and expected her to show up. Then the company downsized, and she became one more file in a list that human resources pretended was only numbers. The savings she had were meant for emergencies, but emergencies have a way of arriving in packs. A late fee became a second notice. A second notice became a threat, and then there was a final date stamped in red ink that she could not erase. On the last morning in her apartment, she moved slowly, not because she had much to pack, but because she could not believe the walls were about to stop being hers. She folded what little clothing she owned into 2 bags and left behind furniture that had taken years to acquire, each piece abandoned like a failed promise. The car was supposed to be temporary. Just a few nights, maybe a week until something changed. But nights turned into weeks, and the calendar on her phone stopped meaning anything except as a way to count how many days she had endured. She learned where to find free water and which stores did not chase people away for standing too long near the entrance. She learned how to make one meal last 2 days by cutting it into portions that left her always slightly hungry, never full enough to forget the gnawing worry in her chest. Hygiene became a strategy rather than a routine. Public restrooms, a sink, a wet paper towel pressed to her face when she could not find a shower. She hated the smell of herself most of all, the way it reminded her that she was slipping beyond the boundaries of the world she used to belong to. At night, the fear was loudest. She kept her keys wrapped around her fingers and slept with a small pair of scissors wedged under the seat where her hand could reach it without thinking. Every passing headlight made her heart race, every crunch of snow outside the car a possible threat. She had learned to read footsteps by sound, heavy boots or light shoes, lingering or passing, danger or nothing at all. Sometimes she did not sleep at all, just lay there watching the frost creep slowly back across the glass after she wiped it away. The city did not see her. People walked past the parked car without noticing the silhouette inside, without guessing that a woman was trying to disappear into the upholstery so she would not be seen, so she would not be judged, so she would not be told once again that she did not belong somewhere. The shame was almost worse than the cold. She avoided mirrors, reflections in shop windows, the eyes of strangers. It was easier to pretend she was invisible than to accept that others could see her and chose not to care. It was during one of the coldest mornings she had yet endured that she realized the car was no longer enough. The fuel gauge hovered so close to empty that she had to squint to see the needle move at all. Her breath fogged the air in front of her, and the heater made a sound like a dying animal before shutting itself off entirely. She sat there for a long time with her hands on the steering wheel, feeling the cold sink into her bones, understanding in a way that no list of overdue bills could ever make clear that she was running out of options. If she stayed in the car much longer, winter would not just inconvenience her. It would kill her. She had heard about the free giveaway almost by accident. A scrap of conversation between two people standing outside a community center where she had gone to warm up for a few minutes. They spoke about a weekend clearance, about people trying to clear out old storage units and garages, about items that were being offered for whatever someone could afford. Normally, she would not have bothered. She had learned not to get her hopes up, but as she sat in the car with the engine silent and the cold closing in, the words came back to her. Free giveaway. Whatever you can afford. She reached into her pocket and counted what was left of her money. $5 in crumpled bills, the last of what she had managed to save from odd jobs and careful rationing. $5 was not enough to change a life, but it might be enough to buy time. She drove there on fumes, the car complaining with every turn of the wheel. The place was already crowded when she arrived, people milling around piles of discarded belongings as though this were a kind of treasure hunt rather than the slow death of other people's former lives. She stayed at the edges at first, pulling her jacket tighter around herself, trying not to draw attention. She was used to being overlooked now, and part of her hoped it would continue. She had no idea yet that this errand, born of desperation and a nearly empty fuel tank, would become the hinge on which her entire existence would turn. She only knew that she could not go back to the car empty-handed. The winter was not waiting, and neither was the slow, creeping sense that she was disappearing. Somewhere among the abandoned furniture and forgotten toys, she needed to find something that could keep her alive. The crowd at the giveaway moved with the restless energy of people who believed they were smarter than everyone else in the room. They circled the piles of donated goods with practiced eyes, lifting corners of blankets, opening drawers, weighing items in their hands as if their instincts alone could sense hidden value. The building had once been a warehouse, but now it felt like a temporary marketplace constructed out of desperation and opportunity in equal measure. Boxes of clothing were stacked in crooked towers. Lamps without shades leaned against broken chairs. Old toys lay scattered across folding tables, their plastic faces worn pale by years of neglect. She drifted between them like a ghost, aware of how different she must look from the others. Their jackets were thick and clean, their boots new enough that snow did not cling to them in dirty clumps. They laughed easily, exchanging comments about bargains and junk, their voices sharp and confident in the cold air that seeped in through the open doors. She kept her eyes low, scanning the chaos for anything that might be more than what it appeared. $5 burned like a coal in her pocket, a reminder that she could afford only one mistake. At first, she found nothing but more of what she had already lost. Tables too large to fit anywhere, books with torn pages, bags of mismatched dishes. Everything seemed to belong to a life that had ended quietly somewhere else, leaving behind only these remnants. It was a child's wagon house, a tiny wooden structure mounted on small wheels, painted once in bright colors that had faded to dull smears under years of weather. Snow clung to the edges of its roof, melting into thin, frozen lines along the seams. The door was barely tall enough for a child, its hinges rusted, the knob loose in its socket. One small window was clouded with grime, but she could make out the faint shape of a curtain inside, hanging crookedly like a tired eyelid. She did not think of it as charming. She did not imagine herself playing inside it or restoring it to some storybook version of a home. What she saw instead was a box of wood with walls that could block the wind, a door that could close, a roof that might hold in warmth if she was careful. Her heart beat harder as she walked closer, each step feeling like a gamble she was not sure she could afford to lose. She was not alone in noticing it, though she was the only one who seemed to want it. A pair of teenagers passed by and burst into laughter when they saw her standing in front of the tiny structure. Someone lifted a phone and aimed it in her direction, and she felt the familiar heat of humiliation crawl up her spine. It was the same look she had seen reflected in shop windows and car mirrors, the look of a person who had fallen so far out of the ordinary world that everything she touched became strange by association. She ran her hand along the wooden siding, feeling the splinters, the grooves where paint had once protected the surface. It was solid in places and soft in others, but it was not fallen apart. Not yet. She opened the little door and peered inside. The air was stale, carrying the scent of dust and old fabric, but it was not as cold as the open room behind her. The space was barely enough to sit upright, but it was space that belonged to no one else in that moment. Space that could be hers. When she turned to look for the organizer of the giveaway, she found a man leaning against a table nearby, watching the scene with the detached amusement of someone who had long stopped caring what happened to the leftovers. She did not ask for the price so much as state what she had, holding up the crumpled bills in her hand. $5. That was all she could offer, and the words were not even spoken aloud, but the meaning was clear. He shrugged in a way that told her the object had no value to him at all. It was too big to throw away easily, too small to sell to anyone who mattered. She was doing him a favor by wanting it. He took the money without counting it and gestured toward the door as though he were finally relieved to be rid of a nuisance. Behind her, the laughter continued. Someone made a show of filming as she wrapped her arms around the little house, testing its weight, discovering how awkward it was to move something designed for children when you were alone in a room full of adults who did not care to help. The wheels squealed in protest as she dragged it across the concrete floor. The tiny door rattled, the curtain fluttered with each jerk of movement. She asked once, softly, if anyone could give her a hand, but the request dissolved into the air without response. Outside, the snow had thickened. The parking lot was a field of white, cars half buried, people rushing past her with their prizes tucked under their arms. She tied an old belt she found in a nearby box around the frame of the wagon house and looped the other end over her shoulder, bracing herself like an animal pulling a sled. It moved only inches at a time, the wheels clogging with ice, her boots slipping as she leaned into the weight. Every few steps she had to stop and catch her breath, feeling the strain in her back and shoulders, feeling the eyes on her even when she refused to look up. The car was parked farther away than she had realized. By the time she reached it, her fingers were shaking uncontrollably and her legs burned with effort. She propped the tiny house against the bumper and rested her forehead against the cold metal, waiting for the dizziness to pass. The people who had laughed were long gone, swallowed by their own lives, their amusement already fading into whatever story came next for them. She remained there, panting in the quiet, staring at the object that had cost her almost everything she had left. She did not yet know where she would take it. The car was too small to carry it anywhere, and she could not leave it behind now that she had claimed it. The thought of abandoning it in the snow made her chest tighten with a fear she could not name. She only knew that this ridiculous, fragile structure was now her responsibility, her gamble against the cold, her refusal to go back to the emptiness of the car without at least trying something different. As she began the slow process of pulling it away from the lot and toward the edges of the city, she felt the shift inside her that comes when humiliation gives way to resolve. Let them laugh. Let them film. None of them would be there when night fell and the temperature dropped even further. None of them would know what it meant to choose a child's wagon house over a meal, to stake the last $5 of a broken life on a box of rotten wood and hope. She moved forward, anyway, dragging her tiny shelter through the snow toward whatever waited beyond the last streetlight, unaware that she was already crossing the invisible line between being mocked and being changed forever. By the time she reached the edge of the city, the laughter from the warehouse felt like something that had happened in another lifetime. The streets thinned out until storefronts were replaced by chain-link fences and abandoned industrial buildings whose windows were dark even in daylight. She pulled the tiny wagon house behind her through slush and half-frozen drifts, its wheels leaving crooked scars in the snow that the wind erased almost as quickly as she made them. The belt cut into her shoulder through her jacket, but she did not stop. Stopping meant standing still, and standing still meant letting doubt creep back in. The place she chose was not marked on any map. It lay beyond a line of tired poplar trees and an overgrown service road that no longer served anything at all. On one side, a shallow ditch collected meltwater and trash that had blown in from the highway. On the other, the land opened into a wide field that looked endless in winter, a white expanse broken only by the occasional weed frozen in place like a relic from another season. There were no houses close enough for neighbors to complain, no bright lights to draw attention, only the muted glow of the city far behind her, hovering over the horizon like a reminder of a world she had fallen out of. She positioned the wagon house so its narrow side faced the prevailing wind, pressing her gloved hands against the frame until the wheels sank into the snow. The ground was uneven, hard in some places, spongy in others, and it took her nearly an hour to find a balance that felt even remotely stable. Each time a gust of wind shook the little structure, her stomach tightened in fear that it would topple over and leave her with nothing but the open field and the darkening sky. Inside, the air was stagnant, colder than she had hoped, but still a degree warmer than the emptiness outside. Dust and fragments of old paper littered the floor, and the fabric curtain she had glimpsed at the warehouse fluttered weakly with every vibration of the walls. She knelt awkwardly, her head nearly brushing the ceiling, and began to clear the space with bare hands, piling debris outside the door in a growing mound. The smell was sharp, the odor of damp wood and forgotten summers, but it was a smell that belonged to a place, and that made it bearable. She had scavenged a tiny metal stove weeks earlier from a pile of discarded scrap behind a closed-down repair shop. It had seemed too small to be useful at the time, more ornament than appliance, but now she hauled it from the back seat of the car with a sense of reverence. Fitting it inside the wagon house was a puzzle that required her to remove a section of the flimsy wall and wedge the stove in at an angle that left just enough room for her to crouch beside it. The pipe that would carry smoke out had to be improvised from mismatched pieces of metal she found nearby, hammered into a crooked chimney that poked through the roof like a broken finger. She worked as the light faded, her movements clumsy with cold, driven by the knowledge that night would not wait for her to finish. When she finally lit the first scrap of paper inside the stove and coaxed it into a flame with bits of broken wood, the sight of fire in that tiny space made her throat ache. Smoke curled up the pipe and disappeared into the darkening sky, and for a moment she feared it would back up and suffocate her. She sat frozen in place, counting her breaths until the draw steadied and the flame began to burn cleanly. The warmth did not arrive all at once. It seeped out of the stove in hesitant pulses, like a timid creature testing whether it was safe to emerge. She held her hands over the metal and watched the stiffness retreat from her fingers, watched the skin flush back into something like life. Outside, the field was already sinking into shadow, the snow turning blue, then gray, then almost black, as the last of the daylight drained away. Her first night in the wagon house was not restful, but it was hers. The wind rattled the walls, the roof creaked, and the sound of the stove popping and shifting filled the small space with a constant, nervous music. She woke every hour to feed it another piece of wood, terrified that if the fire went out, she would not be able to bring it back. Each time she opened the door to step outside and gather more fuel, the cold rushed in like a living thing, clawing at her ankles, reminding her that the field did not care about her small victories. Still, when morning came, she was alive. Frost had formed intricate patterns on the inside of the window, framing the pale light that crept across the snow. Her muscles were sore, her eyes gritty with exhaustion, but the stove was still warm to the touch, and the tiny space held a pocket of air that was not hostile. She crouched there for a long time, staring at the stove as though it were a miracle she did not dare to question. Over the next hours, she made the wagon house into something closer to a room. She pressed snow into the gaps between boards to seal out the wind, arranged a crate as a makeshift table, hung a scrap of cloth over the window to trap what little heat she could. Each adjustment was minor, almost laughable, but together they transformed the place from a joke into a shelter. The city was still visible in the distance, a blur of shapes against the horizon, but it no longer felt like the only place where life could exist. By the second night, the field had become a landscape she knew. She could identify the shape of each tree in the dark, the way the wind bent the tall weeds near the ditch, the quiet moments when even the highway noise faded and the world seemed to hold its breath. The tiny house glowed faintly from within, a lone square of amber in a sea of snow, and she understood with a clarity that startled her that this absurd structure had already changed something fundamental. She was no longer just surviving the night in a car that could be taken away at any moment. She had made a place, however fragile, that answered only to her. She could not have known yet that this field, chosen in desperation, would soon become the stage for everything that followed. For now, it was enough that she had traded the back seat of a freezing sedan for a crooked little room with a fire at its heart. Enough that when she lay down at last and closed her eyes, the sound of the wind was muffled by walls she had claimed as her own. The second morning in the field arrived without ceremony. the light pushing itself through the small, dirty window as if it were testing the limits of the place she had claimed. Her body ached in ways that went beyond fatigue, the result of sleeping folded into herself like a broken hinge, but she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. It was not comfort, and it was certainly not security, but it was a fragile sense of ownership. This cold, creaking little structure was not borrowed time. It was a space that answered to her touch, to the small adjustments she had made with frozen fingers and stubborn will. She moved carefully around the wagon house, testing the boards beneath her boots, listening to the groan of wood as it expanded and contracted with the shifting temperature. The stove had gone dark during the night, but a bed of ash still glowed faintly when she stirred it, promising that heat could be coaxed back into being if she worked quickly enough. She gathered more scraps of wood from the pile she had begun to collect outside, her breath turning to smoke in the open field before she sealed herself inside again. It was while she was sweeping the last of the dust from the corners with a scrap of cardboard that she noticed something that had escaped her the night before. One of the floorboards did not match the others. It was not dramatically different, not enough to catch the eye at a glance, but now that she had learned the pattern of the wood grain under her feet, the anomaly stood out like a false note in a familiar melody. The board was slightly narrower, its nails set deeper, the edges more worn than the rest, as though it had been lifted and replaced many times. She knelt awkwardly and pressed her fingers against it. It shifted under her weight, no more than a fraction of an inch, but enough to send a ripple of anticipation through her. She had no reason to expect anything beyond rot or emptiness, yet the very existence of a hidden space in this tiny house felt charged with meaning. It was proof that someone before her had needed secrecy, had hidden something away rather than let it disappear. It took time to pry the board loose. Her tools were few and ill-suited to the task, and more than once she had to stop and cradle her hands against her chest as feeling seeped painfully back into them. When the board finally gave way with a soft crack, she froze, half expecting the entire floor to collapse beneath her. Instead, a narrow opening revealed itself, dark and smelling faintly of metal and dust. She reached inside and felt the edge of a box. It was heavier than she expected, cold enough to sting her skin through her gloves. She lifted it out of the compartment with care, setting it on the makeshift table as though it might break if she were too rough. The box was dented and scratched, its surface marked with the dull patina of age, but it was solid in a way that suggested it had been made to last. The latch resisted at first, then opened with a reluctant click that echoed loudly in the confined space. She held her breath as she lifted the lid. Inside were layers of paper, folded and yellowed. The ink on them faded to a soft brown that spoke of decades rather than years. Beneath the papers lay objects she did not immediately recognize, wrapped in scraps of cloth that had once been bright and were now reduced to ghostly colors. She unfolded the first sheet she came to and found a notebook filled with careful handwriting. The words were not addressed to anyone in particular, and yet they felt intensely personal, the product of a mind that needed to leave a record of itself even if no one ever read it. The pages were filled with notes about wood, about metal, about the strange joy of making something with one's hands that did not exist before. There were dates scattered throughout, not in any obvious order, and small drawings in the margins, some precise and technical, others clumsy in a way that suggested a child's contribution. More notebooks followed, each one adding a fragment to the story she was only beginning to understand. A man who had built this wagon house not as a toy, but as a moving workshop. a granddaughter who had joined him inside its narrow walls, learning to file and polish, to measure and imagine. The language shifted subtly from page to page, becoming softer, more hopeful when it described the girl, more weary when it turned back to the realities of age and poverty. There were references to summers that were too short, to winters that were too long, to the way the little house had once been a refuge from a world that did not seem to have room for them. Beneath the notebooks were drawings done in bright crayon that time had failed to erase. Houses with oversized windows, suns with crooked rays, tiny figures holding hands in front of what could only be this very structure, idealized and joyful in ways that made her throat tighten. Some of the drawings included strange shapes that she did not at first recognize, until she compared them to the sketches in the man's notebooks and saw the connection. They were imagining tools, imagining pieces of jewelry, imagining a future built out of careful work and shared hours. At the bottom of the box lay the objects wrapped in cloth. She unfolded them one by one, revealing a collection of small instruments so delicate they seemed out of place in her rough hands. There were files no thicker than needles, a magnifying lens set into a tarnished brass frame, tweezers bent with use, tiny pliers whose handles fit neatly into her palm. Alongside them lay a handful of silver fragments, each shaped with a care that spoke of skill rather than chance. They were not ornate, but they were precise, edges clean, curves intentional, waiting for something she could not yet name. She sat back on her heels, the open box between her knees, feeling as though she had stumbled into another person's life at the moment it was least prepared to be disturbed. The story that emerged from the pages was not complete. There were gaps where whole years seemed to vanish, references to troubles that were never fully explained. She gathered that the granddaughter had grown older, that something had forced them to part, that the little house had been left behind not because it was no longer loved, but because circumstances had made love insufficient. For a long time, she did nothing but hold the notebooks and let their weight settle into her. The field outside was silent, the wind reduced to a whisper against the walls as though even the weather were listening. She saw herself reflected in the lines of cramped handwriting and faded drawings, saw the same stubbornness, the same refusal to let the world define the limits of a life. The wagon house had not been meant to be an end. It had been a beginning that had been interrupted. By the time she closed the lid of the box again, the light in the tiny room had shifted, moving across the floor in a slow arc that measured the passing hours. She did not return the box to its hiding place. Instead, she placed it carefully beneath the table, close enough that she could reach it without effort. It no longer felt like a secret she was stealing. It felt like a responsibility she had inherited, a quiet charge to continue something that had been broken before it could fulfill its promise. She did not yet know how she would do that. She only knew that the wagon house was no longer just a shelter from the cold. It was a vessel of memory, a fragile bridge between a past she had never lived and a future she had not dared to imagine until this moment. The box beneath the makeshift table became a quiet presence in the wagon house, a weight she could feel even when she was not touching it. She returned to it again and again in the days that followed, opening it in small, deliberate rituals, as though afraid that if she rushed, the fragile connection she had discovered might dissolve. The notebooks were the first thing she reached for each time, spreading them out across the crate she had claimed as a desk, smoothing the curled pages with her palms. She could not pretend to understand everything written there, but she recognized the devotion in the lines, the careful way each thought had been set down as if it mattered deeply that it be preserved. At first, her attempts to follow the instructions were clumsy in the extreme. The tools felt alien in her hands, their size demanding a patience she had not yet learned. She scavenged broken jewelry from thrift stores and flea markets on the edge of the city, choosing the cheapest pieces she could find, those that no one else wanted because they were bent or missing stones. Each one she carried back across the field like a treasure, even though most of them were little more than tangled chains and tarnished clasps. She had no illusions about the odds. She had survived long enough to know that effort did not guarantee reward. Still, the idea of leaving the tools untouched, of letting the story she had found end with her, was unbearable. The cold made everything harder. Her fingers ached and stiffened whenever she worked for more than a few minutes, forcing her to pause and cradle her hands near the stove until feeling returned in painful waves. The metal she tried to shape seemed to resist her, slipping from the grip of the tiny pliers, snapping when she bent it too far, dulling the fine files that were meant for more forgiving conditions. There were moments when frustration welled up so sharply that she had to press her forehead against the wall and breathe until the urge to throw everything into the snow passed. She ruined more pieces than she saved in those early days. Clasps broke under too much pressure. Links were bent out of alignment beyond repair. More than once, she burned her fingers on the stove while trying to warm numb hands too quickly, the sting adding a new layer of pain to an already unforgiven environment. Each failure felt personal, not because the objects themselves mattered, but because she had begun to see them as evidence of her ability to carry the legacy she had uncovered. And yet, persistence has a way of reshaping what seems impossible. One afternoon, when the light was fading and the field outside the window had turned to a soft blur of gray, she managed to reattach a broken clasp to a simple silver chain. It was not perfect. The join was visible if one looked closely, and the metal bore the faint scars of her inexperience. But the chain held. It lay in her palm with a solidity that startled her, proof that she had not imagined the connection between her hands and the tools. That night, she did not sleep right away. She turned the chain over and over, examining it from every angle, comparing it to the drawings in the notebooks as though seeking approval from a ghost. When she finally placed it on the table beside the stove, she felt a flicker of something dangerously close to pride. It had been a long time since she had created anything that could not be eaten or burned for heat. Encouraged, she worked harder in the days that followed. The wagon house grew cluttered with fragments of wire and tiny screws, with paper sketches of her own layered over the older drawings she had found. She learned to pace herself, to stop before exhaustion made her careless, to listen to the subtle signals her body sent when it was time to retreat to the warmth of the stove. Gradually, the ratio of failure to success shifted. For every 3 pieces she destroyed, she salvaged 1. Then, for every 2 destroyed, 1 saved. The progress was incremental, barely noticeable, but it was real. Her first attempt to trade her work was an exercise in humility. She took a repaired bracelet to a small weekend market that had sprung up in a vacant lot not far from the field, tucking it into the pocket of her jacket as though it might break if exposed to the open air. She hovered at the edges of the crowd, waiting for a moment when she could approach a table without being dismissed outright. When she finally placed the bracelet down in front of a vendor who sold handmade soaps, her voice felt locked somewhere in her chest, and she had to gesture awkwardly to explain that she wanted to exchange it for food. The woman examined the bracelet with a skeptical expression that made her stomach knot, turning it over, testing the clasp, raising an eyebrow at the uneven join. For a long moment she said nothing, and the silence stretched until it seemed to encompass everything the woman had endured since the night she lost her apartment. Then the vendor nodded once and slid a small bag of bread and dried fruit across the table. The exchange was done without ceremony, but it left her with a strange lightness in her chest, as though some invisible barrier had shifted a fraction of an inch in her favor. She ate the bread that night sitting on the floor of the wagon house, the bracelet lying on the table where it had rested hours before. The taste was richer than it had any right to be, each bite carrying with it the knowledge that she had not begged or stolen or scavenged for it. She had made something, however imperfect, and someone else had found it worth accepting. From that moment on, the tiny structure in the field ceased to be merely a place to hide from the cold. It became a workshop in the truest sense of the word. She rearranged the interior so that the table sat closer to the stove, allowing her to work without losing feeling in her fingers every few minutes. She strung a line of salvaged wire along the wall and hung her tools from it, each one finding a place that made sense only to her. The clutter grew, but it was purposeful clutter, the kind that signals activity rather than neglect. As winter tightened its grip on the landscape, she tightened her grip on the fragile future she was building piece by piece. The field outside remained vast and empty, the wind unrelenting, the nights long and brutal. But within the crooked walls of the wagon house, something was beginning to take shape that did not depend solely on endurance. It was the slow, uncertain birth of a craft, and with it the first true hint that survival might one day give way to something like life. The bracelet she had traded for bread did not vanish quietly into the routines of the market. Someone had taken a photograph of it resting against the vendor's rough wooden table, the silver catching what little sunlight the winter sky allowed. That photograph found its way into the loose, unpredictable river of local social media, accompanied not by mockery, but by a simple question about where it had come from. From there, the story changed hands, altered in small ways each time it was retold, until the tiny wagon house in the field became less of a joke and more of a mystery. At first, the visitors arrived out of idle interest. A couple in a dented pickup truck slowed as they passed the line of poplars and noticed the faint glow of light where none should have been. They parked at a distance and walked the rest of the way, boots crunching through the snow, curiosity pulling them closer than caution advised. She watched them through the narrow window, her pulse quickening, the memory of laughter at the warehouse rising unbidden in her mind. When they reached the door, they did not mock or film. They simply stood there, uncertain, as though unsure whether this fragile structure was real. She did not invite them in. The wagon house was too small for that, and too private. But she showed them the pieces she had been working on, holding them out in her gloved hand, explaining with gestures and halting words what she was trying to do. They left her with a bag of firewood and a thermos of coffee that steamed in the cold air like a promise. She watched their taillights fade back toward the city, stunned by how different this encounter felt from all the others that had defined her recent past. Word traveled in its own peculiar way after that. Some came to see whether the stories were exaggerated, whether the woman in the field was real or just another invention of the Internet's restless imagination. Others came with specific intentions, clutching small velvet boxes or knotted chains that had once belonged to mothers or grandmothers, objects they could not bear to throw away even though they were broken. Each time she accepted such a piece, she felt the weight of expectation settle onto her shoulders, a reminder that she was no longer working only for herself. The tone of the attention shifted gradually but unmistakably. Where people had once laughed, they now lingered. Where they had filmed from a distance, they now approached carefully, as though afraid to disturb something delicate. She learned to read the expressions on their faces, to distinguish between those who wanted to help and those who wanted to be entertained. The latter still came, drawn by the novelty of the scene, but she began to set boundaries in small, necessary ways, refusing to pose, declining to let anyone inside the wagon house, protecting the space that had become the core of her fragile stability. With the growing interest came complications she had not anticipated. The field that had once been silent began to show signs of life. Tire tracks etched new paths through the snow. Someone left a stack of pallets near the poplars without asking, as though assuming she would know what to do with them. A local blogger arrived one afternoon with a camera and a list of questions she did not have the energy to answer. She had wanted recognition for her work, but she had not imagined how invasive recognition could feel when it was focused not on her craft, but on her circumstances. She was forced to confront the reality that attention was a double-edged gift. It brought warmth in the form of firewood and supplies, but it also brought scrutiny, and scrutiny invited judgment. She worried about the safety of her location, about the possibility that someone less kind would see an opportunity rather than a story. The wagon house, once hidden by obscurity, now existed in the open. Its coordinates passed from person to person with little regard for the vulnerability that lay beneath its peeling paint. It was in the midst of this uneasy transition that she met someone who did not speak in terms of charity or spectacle. He arrived on a gray afternoon when the snow was falling in a fine, steady veil, blurring the horizon until the field seemed to dissolve into the sky. He did not bring a camera or a bag of donations. Instead, he carried a small case that he set carefully on the ground before approaching, his movements slow and deliberate in a way that made her trust him instinctively. He had seen the bracelet at the market, he explained, and had been curious enough to follow the thread back to its source. He did not dwell on her living situation. He spoke instead about technique, about the way the clasp had been repaired, about the quality of the silver fragments she had begun to incorporate into her designs. His questions were precise, focused on the work rather than the woman behind it, and she felt something loosen inside her as she answered. When he opened the case he had brought, she saw tools far finer than those she owned, polished and arranged with the kind of care that only comes from long familiarity. He did not offer them to her. He simply let her look, let her compare, let her imagine what might be possible if she were not confined to the limitations of her improvised workshop. Then he spoke of a small cooperative in town that rented bench space to independent artisans for a fraction of the cost of a full studio, a place where heat and light were taken for granted, where skill was valued more than circumstance. The idea felt impossibly distant, like a story she might have read in one of the notebooks beneath her table. Yet he did not present it as a rescue. He spoke of it as an opportunity, something that would require effort and consistency, something she would have to earn with the same stubbornness that had carried her through the winter so far. When he left, he did so without ceremony, leaving behind not a gift, but a possibility. That night, the field seemed quieter than it had in weeks. The visitors had gone, the tire tracks already softening under fresh snow, and the wagon house stood alone again beneath the wide, indifferent sky. She sat at her table and held the repaired bracelet she had been working on, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. The laughter that had once defined her existence had not vanished completely, but it had been joined by curiosity, and curiosity by respect. She did not know yet whether that respect would last, or whether it would lead anywhere tangible, but for the first time since she had dragged the tiny house out of the warehouse, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the edge of the field. After the gray afternoon when the man with the polished tools left the field behind him, something in the air around the wagon house shifted in a way that could not be measured, but could be felt. The visitors did not stop coming, but they arrived with a different posture, less like tourists and more like people stepping into a place that had meaning beyond its novelty. The snow between the poplars was no longer pristine. Paths were worn into it, careful trails that curved towards the small structure as if drawn there by an invisible force. She noticed the changes first in the details. Someone stacked firewood under a piece of corrugated metal propped against a tree, creating a shelter that kept the logs dry. Another left a battery-powered lantern hanging from a branch near the door, its soft glow making the approach to the wagon house less treacherous at dusk. None of these gestures were announced. They simply appeared, quiet acts of care that made the field feel less like an accident and more like a shared responsibility. Inside, she began to sense a transformation just as profound. The notebooks she had found beneath the floor no longer seemed like relics. They were references now, guides she consulted with the confidence of someone who had earned the right to interpret them. Her hands moved with greater certainty, the tiny files and pliers responding to her touch as though they had been waiting for it all along. The pile of broken jewelry she had once viewed as a gamble became an inventory, a set of raw materials she could evaluate for potential rather than merely salvage. The people who came brought more than wood and thermoses. They brought work. A woman arrived one morning with a ring that had belonged to her mother, the band bent nearly in half from an accident decades earlier. She did not speak of sentiment, but the way she held the object in both hands betrayed its importance. A teenage boy came with a tangled chain he had found in his grandmother's drawer, hoping she might make something of it before it was thrown away. Each request was a quiet acknowledgement that the tiny wagon house in the field had become something other than a curiosity. It had become a place where broken things were trusted to be made whole again. As her confidence grew, so did her awareness of the story she carried in the box beneath her table. She returned to the notebooks not only to learn techniques, but to trace the fragments of the lives they recorded. One evening, when the wind was so strong that it rattled the walls like an impatient fist, she found a passage she had overlooked before. It mentioned a surname she had not paid attention to, written beside a brief description of a small shop that had once existed in a district now swallowed by redevelopment. The words were casual, almost an afterthought, but they struck her with the force of a revelation. This was not merely a story of loss. It was a story with coordinates. The idea of seeking out the remnants of that past felt both intrusive and necessary. She wrestled with the impulse for days, torn between the desire to honor what she had found and the fear of reopening wounds that had never truly closed. In the end, it was the steady presence of the people who now came to the field that convinced her. They did not treat her as a curiosity or a cause. They treated her as a maker, as someone whose work had value beyond her circumstances. That recognition demanded a kind of integrity she could no longer avoid. She began with the simplest step, a search in the public library she had once used only as a place to warm her hands. There, she learned that the surname in the notebook still existed in the city, attached to a handful of addresses and one faded business listing that predated the internet. The small shop had closed years earlier, but the name remained in old directories, a ghost printed in ink long after the doors had been locked for good. Each new piece of information made the story in the notebooks more tangible, less like a fable and more like a lineage she had stumbled into by accident. The sense of connection was both exhilarating and unsettling. She was no longer the sole inhabitant of the Wagon House's story. She was a steward of something that belonged in part to people she had never met. The silver fragments she had been shaping were not anonymous materials. They were echoes of a craft that had been interrupted, a dialogue between generations that she had begun to continue without fully understanding the consequences. Her growing visibility brought challenges as well. One afternoon, a city vehicle appeared at the edge of the field, its official markings out of place among the weeds and snowdrifts. The man who stepped out carried a clipboard and a polite expression that did nothing to soften the implications of his presence. He walked the perimeter of the Wagon House, taking notes, measuring distances, speaking of zoning and unauthorized structures in a tone that suggested inevitability rather than hostility. She listened with a hollow feeling in her chest, aware that the fragile sanctuary she had built could be dismantled by a few lines of legal language. The reaction from the community was immediate and uncoordinated in the way that only genuine concern can be. She did not ask for help, yet it arrived anyway. People she had come to recognize, by sight or by the sound of their boots in the snow, began to speak on her behalf, contacting local officials, sharing her story not as a spectacle, but as evidence of a gap in the system that needed to be addressed. The field buzzed with a quiet energy, the kind that precedes action rather than attention. She watched all of this from the doorway of her wagon house, uncertain how to feel about the momentum gathering around her. For so long, she had existed at the margins, unseen and unheard. Now, she was at the center of something she had never intended to build. The heart of the community, they called it, though she had never used such a phrase herself. It felt too grand for a structure that barely held together in the wind. And yet, as she looked out over the paths worn into the snow and the lanterns glowing at dusk, she could not deny that the field had changed. It was no longer a place to be hidden. It was a place to be found. That night, she sat with the box open at her feet, the notebook spread out around her, the silver pieces she had shaped gleaming softly in the firelight. The past, the present, and the uncertain future converged in that cramped space, and she understood with a clarity that startled her that she was no longer merely surviving the winter. She was shaping something that would outlast it, whether the wagon house remained where it was or was forced to move on. The little house in the field had become more than shelter. It had become a vessel for stories, for connections, for the stubborn belief that even the most forgotten spaces can become centers of meaning when enough people care to stand around them. The morning after the city vehicle had appeared at the edge of the field, the snow seemed thinner, as if the land itself had begun to understand that nothing built in secret could remain untouched forever. The tracks leading to the wagon house were still there, softened by fresh powder, but no longer innocent. They looked like evidence now, a visible record of how many people had crossed the same distance to reach a small door in the middle of nowhere. Inside the wagon house, the stove warmed the air with the same steady patience it always had, yet the heat could not fully reach the new chill that lived in her thoughts. She had spent so long bracing herself against hunger and weather that she had forgotten what it felt like to fear something abstract, something that arrived with paperwork and rules rather than claws and ice. The idea that an official decision could erase her sanctuary in a single afternoon felt wrong in a way she could not argue against logically. The wagon house had never belonged on any map, and that had been its protection. Now it existed in other people's awareness, and awareness was a door that did not lock from the inside. What surprised her most was that she did not face the threat alone. The field, which had once been silent enough to amplify her own breathing, had become a place where concern moved like wind through grass. Messages traveled from one person to the next, not in the loud, performative way that attention often took, but in quiet currents of practical care. Someone she barely knew brought copies of local ordinances, highlighted and folded, leaving them at the edge of her table as though they were as necessary as firewood. Another person offered a phone number for a legal aid office. A woman who had once come only to repair a ring returned with a thermal blanket and a simple instruction about where to go in town if she needed warmth while things were being sorted out. The support was steady, but it also made the truth impossible to ignore. The wagon house could not remain only a secret refuge. If she wanted to protect it, she would have to bring it into the world that had once pushed her out. That meant names, records, and ownership. It meant acknowledging that what she had found under the floor was not just a gift. It was a history that had a rightful place beyond her hands. That realization drew her back again to the notebooks. In the past, she had opened them for instruction, treating their pages as maps for technique. Now she opened them with a different hunger, searching not for how to shape metal, but for the shape of the lives behind the words. She read with greater patience, letting the older handwriting set its rhythm in her mind. She noticed details she had skimmed over before, references to streets and landmarks that existed only in older parts of town, and small mentions of a family name repeated often enough to become a pulse within the story. In one notebook, between notes about polishing methods and sketches of clasp designs, there was a page that had been torn and reattached with tape. On that page, the older man had written an address, then crossed it out, then written it again. Beside it was a brief, careful sentence about leaving the wagon house somewhere safe until he could return. The sentence did not explain why he had to leave or why return had not happened, but it carried a weight of intention that made her throat tighten. Beneath that, in smaller handwriting that could only belong to a child, a set of initials appeared beside a crooked drawing of the wagon house itself. She could have stopped there and told herself that the past was not her responsibility. She could have kept the tools, kept the notebooks, kept the silver fragments, and treated them as the strange luck that had lifted her out of the worst of the winter. But the longer she stayed in the field, the more she understood that survival built on silence was fragile. If the wagon house was threatened, if her work was beginning to matter to people beyond this frozen place, then the story beneath her feet had to be honored openly. She owed that much to the hands that had built this shelter before her, and to the child who had once filled it with drawings of suns. She went into town on a day when the wind was mild enough to make the trip possible. The library welcomed her with its familiar warmth, and she spent hours in the local history section, moving through old directories and archived community newsletters until she found the name again. It appeared in a short article about a craftsman who had once repaired watches and jewelry from a small storefront, a man known for refusing to throw away broken things. The article included a photograph, grainy and old, showing a tired smile beneath a cap, hands poised over a workbench. She stared at that picture for a long time, seeing in the man's posture the same careful focus she had learned to imitate. The address listed beneath the photo was not the same as the one in the notebook, but it was close enough to be connected. She copied it down. Then, after a pause that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, she wrote a letter. Her handwriting was not as neat as the old man's, but she wrote with a precision born of respect. She explained what she had found, what she had read, and what she had begun to do with the tools. She did not describe her own hardship in detail. She did not ask for money or pity. She simply asked if anyone from that family still existed and if the wagon house meant something to them. She expected silence. She expected that the letter would disappear into a mailbox like so many other attempts at connection had disappeared in her life. For several days, nothing happened. The field continued its routines. The stove burned. The snow fell. Visitors arrived with broken heirlooms and left with repaired ones. The city's presence hovered in her mind like a shadow, but no official vehicle returned. She worked as she always had, filing and polishing and measuring, building her small craft one careful motion at a time. Then, one afternoon, 2 cars appeared at the edge of the field. They did not approach with the quick confidence of curious onlookers. They moved slowly, stopping first beneath the poplars as though assessing the place from a distance. She watched from the window, her hands still, her breath caught between suspicion and hope. When the doors opened, 3 people stepped out, bundled in winter coats, their movements cautious, weighted with emotion that even from afar she could recognize. They walked along the worn path toward the wagon house, not as visitors seeking a story, but as people approaching something that belonged to them in ways no legal document could capture. She opened the door before they reached it, stepping outside into the cold so they would not have to enter the cramped space without invitation. The oldest among them, a woman with gray hair tucked beneath a hat, stopped a few feet away and looked at the wagon house as though it were a living thing. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the force of memory. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden embraces. The moment held itself with the restraint of people who had carried loss for so long that they did not trust joy. She led them closer and showed them the details she had discovered, the floorboard she had lifted, the box she had found, the notebooks now protected in cloth. She watched their faces change as they recognized handwriting, as they traced the faded drawings with careful fingers. The gray-haired woman's eyes filled, and she turned her gaze away, blinking hard against what she could not contain. From them, she learned what the notebooks had never said outright. The craftsman had been their relative, a man who had built the wagon house to keep working when rent and illness had threatened to take everything else. The granddaughter had loved the wagon house because it was the one place where her grandfather seemed happy, where his hands moved with certainty, and his voice had lightness. When circumstances forced a move, the wagon house had been left behind temporarily, then lost in the chaos of a sudden change that no one had anticipated. They had searched for it briefly, then life had moved forward in the cruel way it always does, forcing people to choose what to keep and what to mourn. Over time, the wagon house became a story told with a mix of tenderness and pain, a symbol of something they wished had ended differently. Hearing it, she felt an unexpected fear. She had never considered that her own survival might look like theft when seen through someone else's grief. The tools, the silver fragments, the repaired pieces she had sold or traded, all of it suddenly felt precarious in her mind, as though the foundation beneath her could crack if they judged her wrongly. But the family's reaction was not anger. It was astonishment, followed by something softer and steadier. They saw that she had not treated the wagon house as a novelty. She had restored it in the only ways she could. She had kept the notebook safe. She had turned the tools back into instruments of creation rather than letting them rust into silence. The gray-haired woman asked to see what she had made. She brought out the small pieces she had been working on, the repaired bracelets and necklaces, the simple designs shaped from salvaged silver. The family examined them with the seriousness of people who understood the language of hands and patience. One of them, a man not much older than her, turned a piece under the light and nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had suspected from the moment he saw the wagon house standing in the field. When they spoke about what could happen next, it was not as a demand, but as an offer. They explained that they had connections in the town, people who remembered the craftsmen, people who could help establish the wagon house's history rather than let it be dismissed as an illegal structure. They offered to help her document the find properly, to create a record that would satisfy officials, not by erasing her presence, but by acknowledging her as the person who had preserved what the family had lost. They did not speak of taking the wagon house away. Instead, they spoke of protecting it, and, by extension, protecting her. The support did not come with conditions, but it came with momentum. Within days, a small wave of practical actions began to take shape around her. The legal aid number became a real conversation. A letter was written to a local council member, framed not as a complaint, but as a story of preservation and community care. The family provided copies of the old article and other documents that proved the wagon house had existed long before she dragged it into the field. The officials, who had seemed so distant and unmovable, suddenly became part of a process rather than an inevitable threat. At the same time, the man with the polished tools returned, not alone this time. He brought an invitation to visit the cooperative he had mentioned, a place where benches and lamps and proper ventilation existed, where the air smelled of metal and oil and steady work. She went, stepping into the warm interior with a caution that felt almost like disbelief. The space was modest, not the shining studio of fantasy, but it had what mattered: heat that did not depend on scavenged wood, light that stayed steady through long afternoons, a work surface designed for precision rather than improvisation. She began to split her days. The wagon house remained her anchor, her origin point, the place where she kept the notebooks and the box and the heart of the story. But a few times a week she worked at the cooperative, paying what little she could at first, earning more as her skill improved. There, she learned techniques she had only guessed at in the field, watching the hands of experienced artisans and absorbing knowledge with the hunger of someone who knows what it is to lose everything. Her pieces became cleaner, more consistent. Repairs that once took hours took less. Her confidence grew not from praise, but from the quiet certainty that comes when your work holds up under scrutiny. As orders increased, so did stability. She no longer had to choose between buying food and buying materials. She began to buy proper wire, proper clasps, stones that were not chipped or clouded by neglect. She kept a notebook of her own, not a record of despair, but a ledger of decisions, costs, and plans. The field remained cold, winter still unrelenting, yet the fear that had once been constant in her body began to loosen its grip. She found a small room to rent, nothing more than a space with a bed and a lock, but to her was enormous. A door that opened into warmth. A place to sleep without listening for footsteps in the snow. The wagon house did not disappear from her life when she moved into that room. If anything, it became more sacred. She returned to it often, sometimes to work in the quiet, sometimes simply to sit and listen to the way the stove breathed and the wind pressed against the walls. The family visited too, not frequently, but with enough regularity to keep the connection alive. They spoke of the craftsman with less pain now that they could see his tools used again. They spoke of the granddaughter, no longer only as a lost figure, but as a presence in the drawings that still hung inside the wagon house like small prayers. With the help of the community and the family's documents, the pressure from the city eased. The wagon house was no longer treated as an unauthorized structure to be removed, but as a historical oddity, a relic of local craft, a symbol that had somehow survived long enough to matter again. It did not become a monument with plaques and ceremonies. It remained what it had always been at its core, a tiny shelter built from wood and stubbornness. But it gained legitimacy, and legitimacy gave it breathing room. Spring did not arrive all at once. Snow still fell in late bursts, and the field stayed pale and hard for longer than it should have. Yet there were signs of change. The light lingered a little longer in the evenings. The wind lost some of its cruelty. The paths in the snow began to turn to damp earth. The wagon house, once a dark speck in an endless white expanse, began to look less like a defiant miracle and more like a quiet fixture in the landscape. On one of the first evenings when the air was mild enough to stand outside without pain, she returned to the field alone. The cooperative had closed for the day, and her rented room waited in town, but she drove past both and parked near the poplars, drawn back by a need she could not fully explain. The wagon house stood where it always had, slightly more upright now after small repairs and reinforcement, its roof patched, its door fitting better in its frame. She stepped inside and lit the stove, not because she needed the heat, but because the act of lighting it felt like honoring the chain of moments that had saved her. When she stepped back out, the sky had begun to darken into the deep blue of evening. The field stretched around her, no longer hostile in the same way, but still vast enough to remind her how small a person can be in the face of weather and fate. The wagon house window glowed with warm light, the same amber square that had once been her only defense against the freezing night. From a distance, it looked almost unreal, a lantern set down on the earth by someone determined to mark a place as inhabited. She walked a short distance away and turned to look back. The path of tracks leading from the trees to the wagon house remained visible, pressed into the ground like a signature. Those tracks had once been hers alone, carved out of desperation and stubborn survival. Now they were layered with the marks of others, people who had come not to laugh but to witness, to help, to remember. She stood there until the cold began to creep back into her skin, listening to the quiet crackle of the stove inside the small structure, watching the light hold steady against the dark. The wagon house had never been a real home in the way people use the word, never a place that promised permanence or comfort. It had been something rarer and, in its way, more powerful. It had been a doorway. $5 had bought her a joke in the eyes of strangers, but it had also bought her the first step into a life rebuilt with her own hands. The light in the window did not flare or dim. It simply stayed, steady and patient, as if it had always been waiting for someone to come along and understand what it meant. If this story touched your heart, don't leave just yet. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter in our upcoming stories. Watch the next video now to see how another forgotten life is changed forever. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the smallest light can survive the darkest winter.